Page 317. The Cheka had to be saved. Help save the Cheka. Solovyev asked the tribunal to allow him inside the Taganka prison to visit Gulag, who, alas, was not in the Lubyanka, so as to chat with him. The tribunal declined the request. Then Solovyev managed to penetrate into Gulag's cell without the help of any tribunal, and what a coincidence! At that very point, Gulag became seriously ill. One can hardly speak of evil intentions on Solovyev's part. Krylenko bows and scrapes. Feeling the approach of death, Gulag shakily repented, having slandered the Cheka, and asked for a sheet of paper on which to write his recantation. It was all untrue. He had slandered Kosarev and the other commissars of the Cheka, and everything the stenographer had taken down behind the curtain was also untrue. And who filled out the passes for Meshurskaya, Gretz? Krylenko insisted. They hadn't materialized out of thin air, certainly. No, the chief accuser does not wish to say that Solovyev was an accessory in this case, because there is insufficient evidence. But he advances the hypothesis that citizens still at liberty who were in danger of being caught with their hands in the till might have sent Solovyev to the Taganka jail. This was a perfect time to question Liebert and Rottenberg, and they were subpoenaed. But they didn't appear. Just like that, they didn't show up. They declined to. All right, in that case, question Meshurskaya, Gretz. And can you imagine it? This broken-down aristocrat, too, was so brazen as to not appear before the Rev Tribunal, and there was no way to force her to. Gulag had recanted and was dying. Kosarev refused to admit anything. Solovyev was not guilty of anything, so there was no one to question. What witnesses, on the other hand, did indeed appear before the tribunal of their own free will? The deputy chief of the Cheka, Comrade Peters, and even Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky himself. He arrived in a state of alarm. His long, burning zealot's face confronted the tribunal, whose members sat with sinking hearts as he testified passionately in defense of the totally innocent Kosarev and his high moral, revolutionary, and professional qualities. Its testimony, alas, has not been preserved for us, but Krylenko refers to it this way, quote, Solovyev and Dzerzhinsky portrayed Kosarev's wonderful qualities, unquote. Alas, you careless shave-tail, you, in 20 years' time, in the Lubyanka, they're going to remind you of that trial. It's easy to guess what Dzerzhinsky could have said. The Kosarev was an iron Chekist, merciless to their enemies. That he was a good comrade, a hot heart, a cool head, clean hands. And from that garbage heap of slander, Bronze Knight Kosarev rises before our eyes. Furthermore, his whole biography testifies to his remarkable will. Before the revolution, he was convicted several times, most often for murder. In the city of Kostroma, he was convicted of worming his way in by deception into the house of an old woman named Smirnova and strangling her with his own hands, then of an attempt to kill his own father, and then of killing a comrade in order to use his passport. The rest of Kosarev's convictions were for swindling, and in all he spent many years at hard labor. One could understand his desire for a luxurious life, and he had only been freed by the Tsar's amnesties. At that point, the stern and righteous voices of the major Chekists interrupted the chief accuser. They pointed out to him that those courts which had convicted Kosarev were the courts of the bourgeoisie and landowners, and did not merit being noticed in our new society. But what happened? The shavetail, going overboard, poured forth from the chief accuser's rostrum a tirade so ideologically faulty that in our exposition of this harmonious series of cases, tried by the tribunals. Citing it is to strike a discordant note. If there was anything good in the old Tsar's court system, it was only trial by jury. One could always have confidence in the jurors' decisions, and a minimum of judicial error was to be found in them. It was all the more vexing to hear that this sort of thing from Comrade Krylenko, because just 3 months before, at the trial of the provocateur R. Malinovsky, a former favorite of the Communist Party leadership, who, notwithstanding his 4 criminal convictions in the past, had been co-opted into the Central Committee by the leadership and appointed to the Duma. The accusing power had taken an impeccable class stand. Every crime is the result of a given social system, and in these terms, criminal convictions under the laws of a capitalist society in the Tsar's times do not, in our eyes, constitute a fact branding a person with an indelible mark once and for all. We know how many examples of persons in our ranks branded by such facts in the past, but we have never drawn the conclusion that it was necessary to remove such a person from our milieu. A person who knows our principles cannot fear that the existence of previous criminal convictions in his record will jeopardize his being included in the ranks of the revolutionaries. That is how Comrade Krylenko could speak when in a party thing, but in this other case, as a result of its mistaken judgment, the image of the knight in shining armor, Kozyrev, was being bespattered, and it created a situation in the tribunal where Comrade Dzerzhinsky was forced to say, quote, for just one second, the thought crossed my mind that citizen Kozyrev might be falling victim to the political passions which in recent times have blazed up around the Extraordinary Commission, unquote. And Krylenko suddenly took thought, quote, I do not wish, and I never have wished, that the present trial should turn into a trial of the Cheka rather than a trial of Kozyrev and Uspenskaya. Not only am I unable to desire such an outcome, I am obliged to fight against it with all available means. And he went on, quote, the most responsible, honest, and self-controlled comrades were put at the head of the Extraordinary Commission, and they took on themselves the difficult task of striking down the enemy, even though this involved a risk of error, for the revolution is obliged to say thank you. I underlined this aspect so that no one can ever say to me later, he turned out to be an instrument of political treason, unquote. But that's what they will say. What a razor edge the supreme accuser was walking. But he evidently had certain contacts going back to his days in the underground, through which he learned how things were going to move on the morrow. This is conspicuous in several trials, and came out here too. At the beginning of 1919, there were certain trends towards saying, quote, it is enough. It is time to bridle the Cheka, unquote. This moment was, quote, beautifully caught in Bukharin's essay, in which he said the revolutionary legality must give way to legalized revolutionarity, unquote. Whatever you see, wherever you look, you see dialectics. And Krylenko burst out, quote, the Rev Tribunal is being called on to replace the Extraordinary Commission, unquote. To replace, meanwhile, it, quote, must be no less fierce in implementing the system of terror, intimidation, and threat than was the Extraordinary Commission, the Cheka, unquote. Then it was, the past tense. He had already buried it. Come now, you are going to replace it. And where are the Chekas supposed to go? Ominous days. That was a reason enough to hurry to the tribunal in a greatcoat down on one's heels to testify as a witness. But perhaps your sources of information, Comrade Krylenko, are false. Yes, the heavens darkened over the Lubyanka in those days, and this whole book might be very different, but I suppose that what happened was that Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky went to see Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and talked it over and explained, and the skies cleared. And although 2 days later, on February 17, 1919, the Cheka was deprived of its judicial rights by special decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, it was not for long. One day in court was further complicated by the fact that the objectionable Ubinskaya behaved abominably. For the defendant's bench, she threw mud at leading Czechs who had not previously been touched by the trial, including Comrade Peter. She turned out to have used his pure name in her blackmailing operations. She used to sit right in his office without any ceremony during his conversations with other intelligence agents. Now she hinted at some dark revolutionary past of his in Riga. That's the kind of snake she had turned into in 8 months, despite the fact that she had been with Czechs during those 8 months. What was to be done with such a woman? Here's Krylenko's position, jibed completely with that of the Czechs. Quote, until a firm regime has been established, and we are a long way from that being the case. Are we really? In the interests of the defense of the revolution, there is not and cannot be any sentence for Citizeness Uzbenskaya other than her annihilation, unquote. He did not say to be shot. What he said was, quote, annihilation. But after all, Citizen Krylenko, she's just a young girl. Come on now, give her a 10 or maybe a 25, and maybe the system will be firmly established by then. How about it? But alas, quote, in the interests of society and of the revolution, there is no other answer, nor can there be one, and the question could not be put any other way. In the given case, detention isn't going to bear any fruit, unquote. She had sure rubbed salt in it. The salt didn't. She knew too much, and Kozyrev had to be sacrificed too. They shot him. It was for the health of the others. Can it really be that someday we will read the old Lubyanka archives? No, they will burn them. They already have. As a reader can see for himself, this was a very unimportant case. We didn't have to dwell on it. But here's a different one. Case D, the case of the churchman, January 11 to 16, 1920. In this case, in Krylenko's opinion, is going to have a suitable place in the annals of the Russian Revolution, unquote. Right there, in the annals indeed. It took 1 day to wring Kozyrev's neck, but in this case they dragged things out 5 whole days. Principal defendants were A.D. Samarin, a famous man in Russia, former chief procurator of the Synod a man who had tried to liberate the church from the Tsar's yoke, an enemy of Rasputin, whom Rasputin had forced out of office. Kuznetsov, professor of church law at Moscow University, the Moscow archpriests Upensky and Svetkov. The accuser himself had this to say about Svetkov, an important public figure, perhaps the best the clergy could produce, a philanthropist, unquote. Their guilt lay in creating the Moscow Council of United Parishes, which had in turn recruited from among believers 40 to 80 years old a voluntary guard for the Patriarch, unarmed of course, which had set up permanent day and night watches in his residence, who were charged with the responsibility in the event of danger from the authorities to the Patriarch of assembling the people by ringing the church alarm bells and by telephone, so that a whole crowd might follow wherever the Patriarch might be taken and beg. And there's your counter-revolution for you, the Council of the People's Commissars to release him. What an ancient Russian, holy Russian scheme, to assemble the people by ringing the alarm bells and proceed a crowd with a petition, and proceed in a crowd with a petition. and the accuser was astonished. A danger threatened the patriarch. Why had plans been made to defend him? Well, of course, it was really no more than the fact that the Cheka had for 2 years been conducting extrajudicial reprisals against undesirables. The fact that only a short while before 4 Red Army men in Kiev had killed the Metropolitan. The fact that the Patriarch's case had already been worked up and completed, and all that remained was to bring him before the Red Tribunal. And it was only out of concern for the broad masses of workers and peasants, still under the influence of clerical propaganda, that we have left these, our class enemies, alone for the time being. Unquote. How could Orthodox believers possibly be alarmed on the Patriarch's account? During those 2 years, Patriarch Tikhon had refused to keep silent. He had sent messages to the people's commissars, to the clergy, and to his flock. His messages were not accepted by the printers, but were copied on typewriters. The first samizdat is, like underground writings. They exposed the annihilation of the innocents, the ruin of the country. However, therefore, could anyone really be concerned for the Patriarch's life? A second charge was brought against the defendant. Throughout the country, a census and requisition of church property was taking place. This was in addition to the closing of monasteries and the expropriation of church lands and property. In question here were liturgical vessels, cups, and candelabra, and the Council of Parishes had disseminated an appeal to believers to resist the requisition, sounding the alarm on the church bell. And that was all what's natural, after all. That, after all, was how they had defended the churches against the Tatars, too. And the third charge against them was their incessant, impudent dispatching of petitions to the Council of People's Commissars for relief from the desecration of the churches by local authorities, from crude blasphemy and violations of the law, which guaranteed freedom of conscience, even though no action was taken on these petitions, according to the testimony of Bonch Bruyevich, administrator officer of the Council of the People's Commissars. They had discredited the local authorities, taking into consideration all the violences committed by these defendants. What punishment could the accuser possibly demand for those awful crimes? Will not the reader's revolutionary conscience prompt the answer? Well, to be shot, of course. And that it's just what Krylenko did demand for Samarin and Kuznetsov. But while they were fussing around with these damned legal formalities and listening to too many long speeches from too many bourgeois lawyers, speeches which, for technical reasons, we will not cite here, it turned out that capital punishment had been abolished. What a fix. It just couldn't be. What had happened? It developed that Dzerzhinsky had issued this order to the Cheka without capital punishment, but it had been extended to the tribunals by the Council of People's Commissars. Not yet. Krylenko cheered up and continued to demand execution by shooting on the following grounds. Quote, even if we suppose that the consolidation of the Republic has removed the immediacy of threat from such persons, it seems nonetheless indubitable that in this period of creative effort, a purge of the old turncoat leaders is required by revolutionary necessity. And further, quote, Soviet power is proud of the decree of the Cheka abolishing the death penalty, but this, quote, still does not force us to conclude that the question of the abolition of capital punishment has been decided once and for all for the entire period of Soviet rule, unquote. That was quite prophetic. Capital punishment would return, and very soon too. After all, what a long line still remained to be rubbed out. yes, including Krylenko too, and many of his class brothers as well. And indeed, the tribunal was submitted and sentenced Samarin and Kuznetsov to be shot, but they managed to tack on a recommendation for clemency, to be imprisoned in a concentration camp until the final victory over world imperialism. They would still be sitting there today, and for the best the clergy could produce, his sentence was 15 years, commuted to 5. Other defendants were dragged into this trial in order to add at least a little substance to the charges. Among them were some monks and teachers of Svenigorod, involved in the Svenigorod affair in the summer of 1918, but for some reason not brought to trial for a year and a half. Or they might have been, but were now being tried again, since it was expedient. That summer, the Soviet officials had called on Father Superior Ion at the Svenigorod monastery and ordered him to step lively there to turn over to them the holy relics of Saint Sabbath. The officials not only smoked inside the church, and evidently behind the altar screen as well, and of course refused to take off their caps, but one of them took Sabbath's skull in his hands and began to spit in it to demonstrate that its sanctity was an illusion. And there were further acts of desecration. This led to the alarm bell being sounded, a popular uprising, and a killing of 1 or 2 of the officials. The others denied having committed any acts of desecration, including the spitting incident, and Krylenko accepted their denials. Were these officials the ones on trial now? No, the monks. We'll take a break there.